all that live will die. Coyote knew all along that the stone would sink, for he is the trickster. Because of his stone, man must die. All that man do, Coyote did first.
One spring night in 1883, U.S. soldiers apprehended a young Apache man slipping onto the San Carlos reservation. His name was Tsoe, but the Americans called him Peaches. They suspected he might have information that would lead them to Geronimo. They put him in chains, suspended him by his arms, and interrogated him. Finally, he broke down and told a remarkable story. Although he wasn't Chiricahua, he said he had been taken by Geronimo with Loco's band. When the group was ambushed by Mexicans, he lost both his wives. For a year, Peaches lived in the stronghold, but he missed his family.
Peaches, we must remember, is not a Chiricahua. He is kept under surveillance in the stronghold because people already think he might be a turncoat.
Bilnas tanga aige dego dazundan so bilnas tanglen do biltagorist anita azoro yo azonde bindalta.
Life in the stronghold, Peaches said, was hard. The Chiricahuas moved every few days and were low on food. Yearning to see his mother at San Carlos, Peaches slipped away one night and walked back to the reservation. It was the break Crook needed. Peaches knew where the stronghold was and how to get there. He could lead the U.S. Army to Geronimo. 6 weeks later, Geronimo was in Chihuahua, Mexico, when he had a premonition. Our base camp, he told the other men, has been invaded by U.S. troops. They raced back to find that Crook had occupied their camp with several hundred soldiers and Apache scouts. The stronghold had been breached. Now there was nowhere for the Chiricahuas to hide.
It dealt an absolutely shattering psychological blow to Geronimo and the other Chiricahua. They believed we are always safe here in the stronghold. We can always, even if we can never live in north of the border, we can always come here and flourish.
Reluctantly, Geronimo and the band agreed to return to the reservation. For almost 2 years, it seemed as if peace had come to Arizona. Intent on keeping the Chiricahuas on the reservation for good, General Crook allowed them to decide where they wanted to live. They chose the fertile banks of Turkey Creek, a spot resembling the cool mountain pastures of their traditional home. For the first time in years, most Chiricahuas felt settled. Not Geronimo. He tried his hand at farming, but didn't like it, and he bridled at being bossed around by young white officials. Finally, he'd had enough. On May 17, 1885, Geronimo and nearly 150 people fled Turkey Creek, leaving the majority of Chiricahuas on the reservation. U.S. troops followed close behind.
We were running all the time, my grandpa said. Always living one part one night, moving someplace the next time. The cavalry was always chasing us somewhere. We were running. It was always running.
The fleeing Chiricahuas dispersed. Geronimo led a small group of men, women, and children. Now in his 60s, he was respected as an elder. Although he was not a chief, his band looked to him for leadership and guidance.
In times of danger, he was the man to be with.
According to my grandmother, they were walking miles and miles and miles.
The men would run and the women would ride the horses and follow. The Chiricahua people, they could move 70 miles or 80 miles in one day, where the cavalry that was following them a lot of times couldn't keep up.
They were running from the cavalry, and they ran into these rocks, and they turned themselves into rocks.
Among Geronimo's powers was the ability to suspend time and space. On one particular raid, he was actually able to hold off the dawn for a few hours, and so they could approach in darkness.
The Chiricahuas killed anyone who crossed their path. If we were seen by a civilian, one Apache recalled, it meant that Geronimo would be reported to the military and they would be after us. So there was nothing to do but kill. It was terrible to see little children killed, but the soldiers killed our women and children too. Once, Geronimo feigned friendship with a rancher, asking him to slaughter some sheep and cook them for his men. After they feasted on mutton, Geronimo shot and stabbed his host and the man's wife and children. He would have killed the White Mountain Apache family living on the ranch, but members of his band intervened, guns drawn, forcing Geronimo to back down.
He was driven, and his people were driven to such a sense of desperation and futility and humiliation that striking back in anger could take, oftentimes really quite awfully horrific sorts of forms. You don't take over a continent in an easy way, and you don't give up a continent without fighting hard. So there's a long history that everyone understands that that's what the fight's about, and that it's going to be bloody and awful and violent and painful.
Most settlers in the Southwest now saw Geronimo as simply a vicious killer.
Every time someone died or got raided, it was always Chiricahuas, even if they were far away. And it was because Geronimo was about here and there, bragging and saying things.
By early 1886, the years of hiding, raiding, and running had taken their toll. Even Geronimo was tired.
Morale was pretty low. There are too few of them. There's a sense of doom hovering over the Chiricahua existence.
That March, Geronimo arrived at Cañón de los Embudos, south of the Mexican border, to meet with General Crook. Surrounded by 24 armed Chiricahuas, he sat down to talk about terms for surrender. Beads of sweat rolled down his temples. There are very few of my men left now, Geronimo said. They have done some bad things, but I want them all rubbed out, and let us never speak of them again. There's to demand unconditional surrender from the Chiricahuas, but he knew that Geronimo would never agree. After several days of negotiating,
Crook promised that if the Apaches spent 2 years in an East Coast prison, they could return to Arizona. Geronimo and the Chiricahuas finally accepted Crook's terms.
I give myself up to you, Geronimo said. Do with me what you please. Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you. And that is all. It wasn't all.
Geronimo has one last change of heart, one more vacillation, his always vacillating mind. How did he know this wasn't another double cross?
2 days later, as most of the Chiricahuas headed north with Crook, Geronimo led a group of 21 men, 14 women, and 6 children mostly members of his family, into the night.
When Geronimo made that final break, it's hard to understand what was going through his mind because he knew what he was facing.
Maybe they wanted to go back for one more last look, to say thank you for all that this land has provided them. I don't think he had a coherent plan for a survival strategy that would last for another decade. He was an improviser.
Geronimo took his band into New Mexico. We were reckless for our lives, he later recalled, for we felt every man's hand was against us. If we returned to the reservation, we would be put in prison and killed. If we stayed in Mexico, they would continue to send soldiers to fight us. So we gave no quarter to anyone and asked no favors. Word spread across Arizona and New Mexico that Geronimo was on the loose again. Ranchers pleaded with the White House for protection. We are surrounded by Apaches, one wrote. We have many small children and women with us. For the sake of humanity, send us some soldiers.
The terror, the psychological trauma that Geronimo wrought at the end created this fantasy, the great American Western fantasy. I'm surrounded by Indians. They're going to kill us all.
Incensed that Crook had allowed Geronimo to escape, federal officials removed him from his post. His replacement, General Nelson Miles, was a hardliner with little use for Crook's Apache scouts. Miles requested thousands of reinforcements to bring in the fleeing Chiricahuas.
The Chiricahuas were a tricky group of people. Smart, wise decisions were made. The U.S. military hunted for them almost all over Arizona and on into Mexico, but they were chasing spirits.
They're being pursued by 5,000 American troops, 1/4 of the U.S. Army, 3,000 Mexican troops, possibly 1,000 vigilantes. So you've got 9,000 hunters against 39 fugitives, and they never succeed in capturing a single man, woman, or child. If that isn't brilliant, nothing is.
Journalists flocked to the Southwest and provided lurid and riveting accounts of the fugitives.
He had achieved a notoriety that went well beyond the American Southwest.
That's when he really becomes the most famous Indian in the West, and in the phrase of the day, the worst Indian who ever lived.
Geronimo assumes an important symbolic status. His resistance is seen as the last resistance, not only of Chiricahua Apache people, but of Indian people in North America.
After 3 months of fruitless searching, Miles was forced to turn to the scouts he disdained. Within weeks, 2 Chiricahua scouts with family ties to Geronimo climbed towards his remote mountain camp. Geronimo wanted to kill them, but a member of the band intervened.